Good morning, y'all. It is fantastic to see you out here this morning. I got to tell you, I really appreciate all the prayers. A lot of people were reaching out this week with my pneumonia. It's not as bad as it sounds, but it is definitely much better to be upright than how I spent the last several days. So thank you for that. I appreciate you reaching out. Do see some familiar faces in the audience. Not to point you out, but some former students. Thank you for being here. Appreciate that. And as always, it's good to be here to talk about the Bible. And that's what we're doing right now. Before I get into all that, there's a couple things I want to make sure you know. It was my bad not getting this for the announcements yet. Sorry, Logan. But tonight, we're starting the Bible drill, 5:30 before evening services. And that's for anyone 12 and under. Now, if you're older and you want to hang out in here, I'm not going to kick you out. But it'll be good to talk about some things together. That'd be awesome. Also, there was something else I was going to say and can't remember, so I'm not going to tell you that one. We will look back into the Bible right now, though. I want you to turn to 1 Peter. Chapter 2 is where we're going to start. Just kind of a recap of what's going on here. We have been looking at 1 Peter over the past few weeks, and there was an interesting statement that Peter makes at the end of chapter 5. And you probably remember what it is if you were here for those. But in 1 Peter 5, he tells us what the entire letter of 1 Peter was about. 1 Peter 5, verse 12, towards the end of it, he says, "I've written to you briefly, exhorting and testifying that this is the true grace of God. Stand firm in it." Now, we love the grace of God. We cannot live without the grace of God. But when we think about what the grace of God means and what grace actually looks like, and then you look at what Peter has been talking about throughout 1 Peter, it's almost like it doesn't match up. It's like, wait a minute. I thought the grace of God would look different than what Peter is describing. Because so far, what have we looked at? Well, chapter 1 talks about the true grace of a new birth. So we have the ability, one, to start over. So that's great. But with that comes some responsibilities. Because being born again means that we have a new father and we have new brothers and sisters. And there's a lot of responsibilities that we have towards each other. To our father, God says, "Be holy because I'm holy." That's hard. That's really hard. And to our brothers and sisters, do you remember what he said? We need to be loving and not only show love, but we have to show sincere love, fervently from the heart. That's tough. Does everybody get along with everybody else all the time? No. So that's pretty difficult. These things, but remember, Peter calls them, it's a grace of God. And so what we're going to be looking at, standing firm in the true grace of God. How do we stand firm in it? Now remember, we talked about this too, but grace is something that can be difficult at times because the things that we are called to do as Christians, it's tough. Remember, last time we talked about in chapter 2, the true grace of a new identity. Because we're Christians now, God expects some things out of us. He says that we are now a chosen race, a royal priesthood, and we have all these responsibilities because of that. The children of Israel in the Old Testament, they failed. But now we have that calling, and now we have to live up to that. And that's challenging, and that's hard, but that's all part of it. Today, we're going to be looking at something different. And I'm not going to spoil it. If you saw the sign on the way in, I guess you know what it is. But I want to show you a few things that we're going to look at, just sort of an overview of this morning. So look at 1 Peter chapter 2. We're going to start in verse 13. Notice what the first word or two of verse 13 is. Submit yourselves. So that's verse 13. What about verse 18? Servants, be submissive. Okay, we have that. In chapter 3, verse 1, in the same way, you wives, be submissive. Okay, man, there's this word that keeps coming up, and I don't know that we like it that much. What about, and even in chapter 3, verse 7, you husbands, in the same way. He doesn't use the word submit there, but it seems like he's talking about the same theme. The word of the day is submission. The true grace. Now remember, Peter says this is the true grace of God. and he calls us to be submissive. Now, what does it mean? What does he mean by submissive? What does submission mean? Well, I'll tell you this. Most people probably don't look at the idea of the word submission as a grace of God, because it's almost like a dirty word, right? It's like, I gotta submit? Because I would expect the grace of God would be, if I'm in a situation I don't like, and people are being unkind to me, and this is just a terrible situation to deal with, shouldn't the grace of God mean that I could just walk away from it and not have to deal with that unkindness? Like, that's just stupid. Why would I have to deal with that? Well, let's try to get into what this is saying. Now, when he says here, be submissive, what does it mean to submit? When you think of the word submission, there's almost always an idea in submission that we are looking at something that we have some type of disagreement with what's going on. Because I want to paint this picture for you. What if you said, okay, as an employee, my boss, I listen to my boss. And as Peter says, I'm submissive to my boss as long as they tell me to do the things that I want to do. It's like, come on now. Like, submission is there's something about this situation that's probably not what we would agree with. Like, if we said that, if we were like, I'm very submissive in the things that they tell me that I agree with, that's not submission. That's called agreement. Like, if I agree with what they're saying, of course I'm happy about it. Yeah, I'll do that. But the word submission, there's almost always this feeling of, here's an important part of this. I am voluntarily putting myself below someone and showing that, I would rather have something else. My will is something else. But you know what? I'm going to submit to your will. And so instead of my will, we'll go with your will. And that's really the idea of submission, if you really think about it and boil it down. Let's look at what Peter actually says about submission. So in chapter 2, starting verse 13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Act as free men. Do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bondslaves of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So the first thing he says that we have to submit to, and I'm just going to summarize it with this word, government. So those that are in power as far as like governing offices, and this could be policies, this could be at a national level, it could be state level, and I mean that's the kind of system that we live under. Have you ever heard someone say something along the lines of, it's really hard right now to live as a Christian in our modern society because, like, it's obvious the government doesn't have Christian values and Christian thoughts in mind, and it's like, how do we deal with that? It's almost like it's harder now than it ever has been to be a Christian. Do you agree with that? Is it harder now to be? No, almost in every other century and almost in every other place. It's the things that they had to go through were so much more difficult. It's like, come on now. No, it is not much harder for us than anyone else. You think about when Peter's writing this, and he uses the word king, like submit yourselves to the king. What king is he talking about? Because if you know anything about the situation in the first century, you'll know that Rome was like the world power. And you know who the king was at that time, that specific king? His name was Nero. Do you know anything about Nero? Pretty good guy? No, he was the guy that would take Christians and literally take them alive, put them on a pole, cover them with like oil and wax and stuff, set them on fire, and use them as torches to light his garden parties. That's the guy that Peter is saying you need to submit to. It's like, are you serious right now? Like, this guy, have you experienced this? Like, have you ever thought that I better watch what I say because somebody might put me on a stick and light me on fire? I didn't mean for that to be funny, but we don't think about that. Because that's not like the society that we live in. But this is exactly what these Christians were experiencing. But what would you think if you were alive during this time and you heard this letter? You know, the Apostle Peter is sharing this message with you. He sends this letter to you, and you're reading this, and it's like, honor the king? Like, really? Do you know who this guy is? Like, don't you understand everything that he was doing to us? And I mean, yeah, he says that thing in verse 14 about the governors sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. Do you think the people there might have been like, but that's not what happens? Like, the punishment of evildoers, it's the people who are being punished are the Christians. Does God not know that? Does Peter not know that? Is that something that they just, well, I guess they're not paying attention. You don't know who the king is. You don't know what Nero's doing. Well, I think he did for multiple reasons. Look at verse 15, though. For such is the will of God, that by doing right, you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Is it possible that leaders can be foolish and ignorant? Absolutely. So true. They really can. And I think that Peter, a lot of times when we look at this verse, we don't see it this way, but I think he is talking about the leadership, about how they were very ignorant, and they were doing things that, I mean, it was just obviously not the right thing to do. But he says what we do with it, what do you do with that? Like, how do we fight against that? Well, he says honor them, and he says to be in submission to that. And what that does is it says it silences those ignorant and foolish people. Because what happens is when we endure something that we don't deserve, and we go through something that's obviously just like way out of the ballpark, like this is ridiculous that people are going through this, and we do this and we experience that, what evil things will our leaders have to say against us? Because if you think about it this way, there were a lot of people in the first century. There were a lot of leaders and the people in places of power in the Roman government in the first and second century that really kind of had a problem with knowing what to do with Christians. Because what happened is we even have letters like saved of people, of Roman leaders from the first couple centuries who were like sending letters to each other and be like, what are you guys doing about this Christian thing? Because we have people, and it doesn't matter what we do to them. I mean, we throw them in the Colosseum and have them devoured by lions. But you know what the Christians keep doing? Like, they keep like being respectful and good, and they keep paying their taxes. It's like, what is up with that? Like, we can't shake them. There's nothing that we could do to rattle these guys. I wonder why that was. I wonder why Christians had that mentality and mindset. Could it be that some of the things that Jesus taught were the same things? Maybe some of the things like bless those who curse you, love your enemies, go the extra mile. Do you know what that one means, by the way, go the extra mile? Like a Roman soldier could literally come to you and say, hey, I don't want to carry my stuff. It's really heavy. You carry it, and they could legally force you to carry that 1 mile. You know what Jesus said about that? If they have you going 1 mile, go an extra one. Go 2. Was that fair? Absolutely not. But that was the mentality that these Christians had. You have Peter saying things like, submit yourselves to these authorities. And really, what it came down to it is there was nothing that the Romans could do to shake them. And it really bothered them. It was like, man, we're trying to tear them down, and they're unfazed. What is this? Would you say that most Christians today have that same mentality? Absolutely not. Now, it's embarrassing to say, but I don't think it looks like that at all right now, and especially if we look at like American Christianity, what that looks like. Could we say the same things about American Christianity as we did then? It doesn't seem that way. I mean, could we eventually end up being persecuted for our beliefs? For saying, okay, God says this is what God expects, and we just gotta deal with that. Is it possible that we could experience some kind of persecution for that, just for trying to tell people what God is saying? Absolutely. But what's what does Peter have to say about that? What does God say about that? Submit. Like, we have to understand that the government's not always going to agree with Christian values and morals. And so we have to understand, we have to show honor, and that's how we silence the ignorance of the foolish men. Now, there is one thing I want to point out in verse 17 before we move on, because I think this is really important. He says, honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Notice he uses the word honor for all people, and he uses the word honor for the king. Those people are the ones that we need to honor. But what does he say about the brotherhood? What do we do with them? Love. Yeah, so we love them. Now, that's a callback to chapter 1, not just like acting like it or saying, but sincerely, fervently from the heart. That's how we love each other. But how do we look at God? We fear God. You know, not in I'm scared of punishment, but it is a much higher level of respect. Because, honestly, the Christians in the first century, they were getting killed. But is that the worst thing that can happen? Like Jesus even said, don't fear those who can harm your body and destroy your body, but fear the one who can destroy your body and your soul. That's the important thing. And so God only holds that level of fear. And so we got to keep that in perspective. And remember, God's still in control. It's not like he doesn't see, he doesn't hear, he doesn't understand. He absolutely does. So I don't want you to get that out of whack either. Now, let's look at the next section, because I think this will help us think about some things too. Verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters, with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor, if for the sake of conscience toward God, a person bears up sorrows when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and suffer for it patiently, you endure it, this finds favor with God. So he says we're submissive to masters. He says that. And a lot of times we make common, what do we look at that today? Like bosses. The system of economics, a little different back then. And so we might think about that a little bit. But I want you to think about, take yourself and pretend like you were in the first century. And not only that, you were a slave in the first century. And you're hearing this message from Peter. And you're there, and maybe you have a master that's kind enough to let you go to like the weekly worship service, and you're able to go and assemble with the saints, and you're with everyone, and you get this letter from Peter. But while you're there and you're talking with Peter, there's this guy that's there, and things aren't going well for him. He's also a slave. But you come, and he comes into the assembly, and he's like really kind of beaten up, got a black eye, and maybe kind of limping a little bit, and it's like, man, what's going on? And he's like, you don't understand what it's like. Like, it's really bad. It's so difficult. Like, my master is just an absolute monster. He's a tyrant. What do you do with that? What do you say to that? If we think about what kind of advice we would give that person now, and now, keep in mind, things were different, so we got to consider that. But what we might say is things like, well, sue him. Get away from that. You don't have to deal with that. And that's, I think, the big message that we would push there. But just being imagining. Imagine this. You are sitting there in that assembly, and you have this letter from Peter. And he gets to this part, when it's being read out loud, he gets to this part where he says, servants. And automatically your ears pick up. It's like, okay, so he's talking to me. What do I need to do? And his first words of encouragement there, be submissive to your masters. Ooh, I don't like that. Now, I'm sure some of them probably said, I can do that. My master is pretty respectable, so, I'm good. I'm good with that. But then you got the guy who says, but my master's not. Like, it's not really that great where I am. What do I need to do? Well, Peter keeps going. With all respect, not only those who are good and gentle, but also with those who are unreasonable. Ooh, goodness. That's intense. Now, one thing I'll mention here as a side note. When we think of slavery and servants, I think in America we have a really different view of what that looks like. The slavery that happened in America was based on kidnapping, and like that's a whole can of worms there. Like that was not a good thing at all. Like don't get me wrong on that. In the first century, and even before that, the Old Testament, God does talk about slavery. But it's interesting when you look at the economic standing of like the world in general. We would probably classify that as some kind of indentured servitude, or like it was the economic system of the time. Not saying it was great, but that's the way it was. And the thing about the laws in the Old Testament about slavery, this is really interesting. There was so much more that protects the rights of the slave than in any other like law that was around at the time. And did you know that if you had to, and what would happen is you have a debt that you can't pay, so you will go into a slavery situation where you have someone who is the master and you are working your way out of that debt. The maximum amount of time that you could serve as a slave was 6 years, because every 7th year they were required by the law of Moses to release the slaves. You had to. So that was, unless you were like, hey, life's pretty good with this master, I want to permanently secure my place here. And so they would do the whole like piercing the ear with the awl thing on the doorpost. Anyways, I said all that to say it's a very different mindset of what slavery looked like. And I don't want you to get the wrong impression there. But still, coming back to this, we might relate with, my boss is a jerk. My boss is not a jerk, by the way. For those of you who know him, like, I say good things. But there are people who say that, right? Like, my boss is a jerk. Like, this is ridiculous. Why do I have to do all of that? Like, they keep piling on stuff. And it's not fair. It's not right. Well, what he says is that, we need to still submit. Even if the person is being unreasonable and it's not great, that's what we do. And the argument he uses here in verses 19 and 20. Have you ever done something stupid? Yes, you have. But have you done something stupid and got punished for it? Like, had to have some type of punishment for what you did wrong? I would imagine so. Like, we've all been there. Now, when you experience that punishment, like, do you ever think to yourself, man, I am such a champ the way I'm taking this punishment? Like, maybe you're grounded or something. It's like, I'm just handling this real well. I'm great. Really? Like, when we endure some kind of punishment because it's our fault and we deserve it, like, what credit is there for that? It's like, well, good job, because like that was your punishment to begin with. So why does that matter? The thing that really finds favor, that's the word that's used here in my version anyway. The thing that finds favor is when you're able to endure something that is absolutely terrible and it's not your fault. Like, you have no business being treated the way that you are, but you're able to patiently endure that. That's hard. That is so challenging. But did you know Peter calls this a grace of God? Like, this is what this section is about. And so when we're able to patiently endure, that's when it finds favor. Now, some of your versions might use a different word for favor. I know I'm using the New American Standard. And there's actually a side note on mine that instead of the word favor, the word that's actually used there is grace. And so he uses that twice. You see that in verse, where are we at? Verse 20, it finds favor with God. Also in verse 19, this finds favor. And so what we're doing is we're finding grace. And now, this isn't saying that your suffering is the grace. Like, I think what he's saying is, and especially, and you see this in verse 20, this is favor to God. It's like we are giving God a gift of sorts in the way that we patiently endure things. And that might be hard to like wrap your mind around. If you're a parent, you might be able to understand this, and maybe you've seen some kind of situations where this play out. But you know what is just really amazing as a parent? To know that your kid has every right to be frustrated with the situation, every right to just lash out, whatever. But they are able to patiently endure something that, I don't know, maybe their sibling is just being so obnoxious and they don't punch them in the face. This is great. You all are doing what you need to do. Or they're mistreated in some way and they stand up for what's right. That is such a good thing to see. This is what happens when we are doing that in our lives. God sees that. And remember, he understands. So this is something to consider. Finds favor with him for sure. Now, I'm going to intentionally skip over a few verses. I'm going to come back to those. Don't worry. We will just very soon. But there's a reason I want to go ahead and jump into the next section. Chapter 3, verse 1. I want to read this with you. In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. Your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold jewelry, putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. For in this way, in former times, the holy women also, who hoped in God, used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. And you have become her children, if you do what is right, without being frightened by any fear. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there, and we're not going to actually get into all the details there. There are a couple things that I want to mention about this. Notice, he said that the examples that we have are the ones in the Old Testament who showed their submissiveness. Now, uses specifically Sarah as an example. Said she called Abraham Lord. Now, do you know what verse in the Old Testament shows that she called Abraham Lord? Now, some of you are cheating right now because you have those little marginal notes and it tells you a passage to go to. And it probably tells you to go to Genesis 18. And so I'm going to ask you, go to Genesis 18. I want to look at something real quick. Genesis 18, there's this scenario where these angels come and appeared to Abraham, and they're actually getting ready to tell them that they're going to have a child. They're going to have a kid. And that's where Isaac came from. But in Genesis 18, verse 9, they said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" He said, "There, in the tent." He said, "I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Sarah was past childbearing. Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord also being old?" Okay, so in this verse, who does she say? Who does she call Abraham Lord directly? Is she talking to Abraham there? Who is she talking to? Herself. That's interesting, isn't it? So it's not something that she said out loud to him. And so I don't think the Bible's teaching here that you call us Lord. That's not it. That was more of a term of respect. It wasn't like that. But what she did is, it was the way that she was thinking about Abraham. She didn't actually say this out loud, but she was thinking it, which is kind of funny, what in a strange way. Because you have people, I think, today, who you would say, "Oh, that wife is acting pretty submissive." No, she's saying, "Oh, yes, of course, honey, I will do what you want." Not that I've experienced that. But in the mind of the wife, she might be thinking, "You little jerk face, what?" It's you're saying the right things, but you're not thinking it. Now, Sarah is showing that this is how she thinks. She, in her mind, is thinking this way about Abraham, which is really interesting to me. It's more of a thought. And I want you to be clear on this. 1 Peter 3, verse 6, the phrase at the end of that verse, "without being frightened by any fear." This isn't a thing where the wife is frightened into submission, because again, that's not submission. Submitting to someone is a voluntary thing. It's understanding that I don't really have to do this, but I am willing to do this. It's a willing idea that you have. And it's not motivated by fear. It's nothing like that. It's a different way of looking at things. There's a lot more we could say about that, but we're going to run out of time, so I want to make sure that we talk about this whole passage. Verse 1 is troublesome for a lot of people, because when it talks about this, be submissive to your own husbands. Whew, okay. You have a lot of people, a lot of women who are in situations that if you talk to them, you might hear things like, but you don't know what it's like. Like, you don't know really what this guy is like. I mean, you don't know, especially if like the wife is a Christian and the husband's not, and it's like every time I want to go to worship service, like I hear about it, he complains. Every time I want to like contribute, put something in the offering, like it's just a huge fight, and it's just it's terrible. And sometimes it's even worse. It's like, man, he's angry all the time. He's doing these things. Now I want to say something. I want to be very clear about this right here. If there is a situation where the husband is being abusive, there is some type of illegal activity going on, maybe doing drugs around the kids, whatever. Like, there are situations where that happens. But I think in that case, we would have to go back to chapter 2, verse 13, where we submit ourselves to these human authorities. Because what's the purpose of the authorities? To be able to punish the evildoers. And I think in that case, that's a time where you seek guidance from the proper authorities. Call the cops. We have passages like Romans 13, the first few verses of that, calling the government God's messengers, God's ministers to do what's right, punishing the evildoers. And so if that's a situation that you know of, like, just be clear, like, we need to get the authorities involved. Like, that's definitely something that we need to pay attention to. Don't just say, well, deal with it. No, that's why we have these authorities. So anything but short of that, though, what if like there's just something, he's not a Christian, she is, and he's giving him a hard time about it, it's just not working out. What do you do? What kind of things can you say? Now, I tell you, if someone came to me and started telling me all this and just started saying, Jason, you just don't know what it's like. You know what? I really don't. I don't. I can't relate to that at all. I have no idea what it's like and what you're going through and what you're suffering right now. But I think that's why verse 1 starts out the way it does. In the same way, you wives. In the same way as what? Like, what are we talking about there? In the same way. Who are we talking about there? I skipped a section of Scripture on purpose for dramatic effect. And here it is. Let's look at the end of chapter 2, verses 21 through 25. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. And he himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by his wounds you were healed. For you were continually straying like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. So what he's saying there is our model of submission, of what submitting looks like, is Jesus himself. And so it doesn't matter what situation you find yourself in. If it's a wife who's dealing with this situation, if it's anything we read before about like submitting to the government or submitting to an unhelpful boss, master, whatever, our example is Jesus. I might not be able to relate to you. I might not be able to like really empathize and understand what you're going through, but Jesus can. And that's the important thing. Jesus suffered all of these things, and he encountered this. He is the picture of submission. If you think about it, isn't it strange? Almost from cover to cover in the Bible, we have our need to submit to God. Like, would you agree? Like that's a thing you see a lot, that we need to submit to God. But it's so strange that there was one point in history where, in a way, God himself submitted to us. That God eternal God, was willing to put on flesh, to dwell among us as a human being, and then submit his will to the will of the people who were trying to kill him. Now, ultimately, we understand that was God's will. But Jesus, knew that the Romans, well, it wasn't the Romans, it was the Jews first, who were wanting to kill him. And you know what he did? He let him do it. He was submissive to that. And so in a way, Jesus submitted to all of us to be able to heal us. How did he do that? How was he able to, like it says, when he was being reviled, he didn't say anything in return. He didn't argue back. He knew that was not fair. But he endured that because of us. That is insane. And at the end of verse 24, by his wounds you were healed. How does that make sense? Like, why am I able to be healed because he got injured? Have you ever had to have a surgery? Like, there's something wrong with your body, and you go in, and the doctor says, okay, well, I can heal you, but you know what I'm going to have to do to you first? I'd have to cut you open and cut that out, take it out. Now, so who is the one being wounded there? Like, you are. The doctor is wounding you, but for what purpose? To heal you. So, in order to heal you, you are the one that's wounded. That's how it normally works. You know, this is how, like, discipline in general works. Like, if someone needs to do better, maybe it's a parent-child relationship, whatever, it's the child who gets the punishment in order that they may get a benefit out of that there's a wound so you can be healed. But this isn't the way that our salvation works. He is wounded so we can be healed. It's like you go into the doctor and the surgeon's like, tell you what, to fix you, I'm going to cut open my own body and take stuff out, and then you'll be better. That doesn't make sense. But that's exactly what Jesus did. Now, I think to further emphasize this, in verse 25, for you were continually straying like sheep. That was us. We were all over the place. But now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls. Jesus is the loving shepherd. He is the shepherd. And there are parables that talk about, like, Jesus, he had 100 sheep, and then the one wanders off. And what does he do for the 99? He's like, I'm going to leave him there, and I'm going to go get that one, right? This is not the picture we're seeing in this verse. Because it says that we, like wandering sheep, we're the ones who are coming back to him. How does that work? Well, did you know? Like, there's a practice in shepherding. There's probably a better word for that. But you have this situation, and if you've never heard this, you're going to think this is wild and crazy. But if you have a sheep that is constantly wandering off, do you know what the proper way to handle that sheep is? You break its leg. Now, that sounds like terrible. It's like, whoa, why would you do that? Well, one, a sheep with a broken leg can't wander off. That's true. But two, what happens is while that sheep is recovering, the shepherd will literally, like, have the sheep, it was like carry around on his shoulders. And they would actually have such a bond together that by the time that the sheep's leg was healed, like, they were so connected, the sheep would never wander off again because that had such a connection to the shepherd. Jesus is so great and so different that it's not even he's breaking our leg so we stay close to him. It's he breaks his own body. And he suffers all of that to heal us. He was wounded so that we can be healed. That's insane. And so, no matter what situation we're in, no matter how difficult our situation, circumstances are, remember that. Like, we are going to have to go through some hard stuff, hard times. This is the grace of God, knowing that we can do what he calls us to do because he showed us that he did it first. And he loved us so much that he was able to do that for us. That is insane. One more thing I'll mention about this in passing. You know, this idea of God came to earth, received this punishment for us to draw himself to us. It's really a picture of what we need to do for others, right? Because in our interactions with other people, sometimes we just get so angry. and so upset, and we just want to lash out, and we just want to punch them in the face and say, like, why don't you listen to the truth? Is that how you win souls? Absolutely not. God's plan of reaching people was not, hey, grab a sword and go and fight them until they agree to be a Christian. That's never been God's plan. People have tried that, and it's not worked out too well. That's not what God does. He says, no, you be willing to be wronged. You be willing to return good for evil. If someone comes at you, we understand, it's something that we need to be submissive to God's will in order to reach them. And so that's really how you want to reach them. And so I think that's why in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, when he's talking to the wife who is trying to encourage her husband, who's not a Christian, what do you do? Do you nag and argue and that sort of? No. You do what's right. You do the right thing, and you hopefully can win him without a word. And I think this goes for all of our interactions with everybody just in general. That's how we reach people. We reach people because we're willing to submit to God's will on this. Now, there's one more verse that we need to talk about. Forgot to put that up there. Jesus submits to us. That's important. But there's one more thing he says. In chapter 3, verse 7, he's talking to a different group. He says, now husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. Wives might look at this section and be like, okay. We have 6 verses talking about what we need to do, and husbands only have 1. It's really? How is that fair? That's ridiculous. But think about sort of the structure of what Peter says to them. He says to the wives essentially, okay, you're gonna have to do some tough stuff, hard things, true. You're gonna have to submit to this guy, and he might not be the best guy ever. But in doing this, God is going to see what you're doing, and you are going to be precious in His sight, and He's going to reward you for that. That is such an awesome thing. Look at what He says to husbands, though. First of all, He says husbands in the same way. So I think He's also saying husbands need to submit to their wives in some ways too. That shouldn't be a surprise. Ephesians 5:21 says that we all submit to each other. So that's a thing that the Bible teaches. But in what way? How so? Well, it says, and I'm so thankful. I am very thankful for what Peter doesn't say. Peter doesn't say, husbands, understand your wives. I am so grateful for that. And again, I think I've learned enough to not mention any personal stories with this. But she's saying, nope, don't do it. So I won't. But if you just think about it, wives, have you ever been in the situation where you're asking your husband, why don't you understand me? But then if you're thinking about it, do you really understand yourself right now? Do you understand your feelings, your thoughts, emotions? I don't understand myself most of the time. Why do I feel this way? A lot of people experience this. And so Peter's not saying, now you have to do some kind of Rubik's Cube maneuver and figure it out. He's saying, live with your wives in an understanding way. Understanding that there's going to be differences, that she is not the same as you. She is not going to be thinking the same way as you. She is not going to be experiencing emotions the same as you. And you need to be mindful of that. Don't be a jerk. You need to understand that she's different. And so when we look at that, that's why in Ephesians 5, they're told love their wives. Sometimes husbands forget that. We forget to be loving and kind and gentle and all of that sort of thing. And so he says that. Now, here's the thing, though. It does mention, and I'll say this in passing as well, he calls women fellow heirs. It's not saying that men are better. He's saying we're on the same playing field there. We're fellow heirs of recipients of the gospel. And so we're both on the same playing field. But husbands, if you do not do your job, what does the last part of the verse say? This is so scary. It's kind of haunting. It says that so that your prayers will not be hindered. Ooh. What would it look like for your prayers to be hindered? And so what I think is going on here, he's saying that you're going to be praying, you're going to be saying things to God, but it's not going to do any good. God's not going to listen to you. Have you ever wondered what that's like from God's perspective? Like what he's experiencing with this? Like you have a guy who is just, he's ridiculous. He's not listening to his wife. He doesn't care what she's feeling, what she's experiencing, her emotions, her thoughts. Like, I'm not going to listen to any ideas you have, and just like very unforgiving. And honestly, I think this could work in different situations when we are not forgiving in friendships and relationships, and a boss is looking at his employees the wrong way. So we have all of these things. When God sees you doing that sort of thing, and then you come to God and say, God, please help me. I'm weak. I need help. I need you to deliver me from this. I need you to forgive me from this. What God's going to say is, you expect me to do something that you're not willing to do for other people? That's harsh. That's challenging. But there's several passages that talk about how that can happen. And so, husbands, be careful. This is something we have to really strongly consider and understand. When you consider all of what we've talked about, this is the true grace of God. It doesn't sound like it. It's really challenging. But Peter says this is the true grace of God, and we have to stand firm in it. You can see why he says stand firm in it. It can be something that's hard to stand firm in. So it's these topics are difficult to work around. But just know, every single Christian that has ever existed and that exists right now, we're part of this. Maybe you've experienced things where you know that your boss hasn't treated you the right way, or your spouse, or work relationships, or even the government. I mean, we probably all experienced that at some point. No matter where we are and what we do, we understand God still has a plan for you. And that plan is to submit. To submit first to God, fear him. But because of our respect and honor for God, we're willing to go through situations that are really challenging and really difficult. And God sees you in that, even though it's challenging. Even though we don't like it, that will be the thing that makes us precious in God's sight when we can do that. Treat others with kindness. No matter what's coming your way, we will not be able to reach other people if we're not being kind and gentle. And that's why I think the Bible says what it says. Morning about what to do specifically in order to have a relationship with God. Like 1 Peter's written to a group of people who they're already Christians. And he's given them some instructions on what to do. If you're not a Christian, we're ready to help you to obey the Lord. There's several things that we're told in the Bible what we need to do to obey. Now, we have to obviously believe in the Lord. Do you believe in Jesus? Are you willing to confess him as your Lord? Not just asking him for salvation, but confessing that he is the Lord of your life, that he's the one in charge. Willing to repent of your sins, to change your lifestyle, to understand that I've been going in one direction and I need to turn to God. Whatever way God is, that's where I need to turn. And to be baptized, to wash away your sins, calling on his name. If you are a Christian and you've done all of these things, but you realize you haven't been living the life that you need to, maybe you're not as submissive as you should be. Maybe your anger has got the best of you. Maybe there's an infinite amount of sins that we could have in our lives. Whatever it is, we need to take care of that because God loves you. God expects you to follow him. If you are ready to follow the Lord, please come forward as we stand and sing.